The Lawyer Who Rocks is brought to you by Hughes Media Law Group. You can visit HMLG at hmlglaw.com. Keep up with the podcast on social media at HMLG Law on all major platforms, and be sure to follow us there. Thank you for listening and enjoy this episode of The Lawyer Who Rocks. My name is Jolene Winther Hughes. I am a lawyer who rocks.
When it comes to having your back, there ain't nobody better. This you better believe. Jolene.
Well, today I have a guest who I have worked with for over a decade. First at a company that he worked with another of my podcast guests, Brent Stiefel, and then he came up with the most amazing idea for an app, and he and Brent went into business together, and now he is, voila, the CEO of a startup called Distiller, which is actually not quite a startup anymore. So I'm really excited to welcome Mikael Mossberg to the podcast today. Welcome. I'm so happy to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here.
So I'd love to start from the beginning and find out where you're from and how did you start your journey?
Yeah, I have kind of an interesting origin story. Not all that unique in America, but child of an immigrant. So my dad came to the US on a track and field scholarship and met my mom when he was in physical therapy school, and then had me. So I grew up in San Diego, but was a dual citizen of the United States and Sweden, and grew up speaking both languages in the house. And then when it was time to go to college, I knew I wanted to stay in California. So I went up the coast to Santa Barbara. And on my final day of college, I turned in my paper and drove down to LA and dropped off a bunch of applications. And one of them was at Warner Brothers Records, and ended up getting a job there and starting a career in the music industry, because I'd always kind of been interested in music and played in bands and been part of the music scene in San Diego when I was in high school. And so that started my career, was working at a major record label. And when I started there, I worked on street teams. So I was in charge of managing all the different, street teams for bands like My Chemical Romance and Green Day and things like that all over the country. And worked my way up to the point when I left, I was a director of community in the new media department, which dates me because I don't think that term is used anymore. And, while I was there, I kind of started getting into spirits and whiskey specifically, just thought it was interesting, and joined the Los Angeles Whiskey Society, the 7 Grand in downtown Los Angeles, and just kind of, was into it from a hobbyist perspective, and started to learn more about it. But at the same time, was constantly frustrated trying to find new things to try. And I felt like there really weren't any good, concise outlets for good information about this stuff. It was always very 9,000 word diatribes by some guy in Scotland that was really hard to kind of understand. And all the communities around it were very much for connoisseurs and not so much for beginners. And started kind of working on a little idea then. Eventually left Warner Brothers. And as you mentioned, that's when I met Brent. After working together for a little bit, I actually mentioned this idea to him that man, why isn't there an app for people who are like us that want to learn more about spirits and try new things, but they just don't know what to try next? And that was sort of the beginning of Distiller. And, the rest is history, as they say.
I love to spend time really comparing bands and the music industry to startups because there's so many similarities. But when you left the label and you decided to go work at Backbeat with Voda, which is, again, I mentioned Brent Stiefel was on the podcast a couple years ago. What did you go there to do? I mean, that was really probably your first foray into a startup.
It definitely was. I left Warner Brothers with a couple other guys that were also, former Warner employees. And at the time, the company had just gone through a giant shakeup. They had fired the CEO, the COO, department heads. It was like a bomb had gone off in the building. People were sitting on the ground crying. It was really crazy. And, I had been through several years of seeing people laid off several times a year in big cycles. And I just thought, this is not for me. Some people, they love being in a big corporate culture and they love having their security of that and they love having their position in it. And I just thought God, what a awful place, an environment to be in where something like this could happen. So, I left, and when we started Backbeat, The goal was to provide a lot of the same expertise that we provided at a label, but a label is a bank essentially that provides services. It's an investment group, they're investing in the X, and in that way they're sort of like VCs, right? It's all speculative. The majority of what they go after will fail, but the ones that succeed will pay for, you know, the failures and more. And, what we wanted to do was work directly for the artists instead of the other way around. So we worked on a bunch of really interesting artists, large and small bands that were Kasabian comes to mind. They were huge in the UK. We worked on a ton of really interesting artists, worked directly with them and sat down and kind of planned out and got creative with, interesting marketing campaigns. I remember, you know, sitting down with like Coheed and Cambria and talking with their manager several times a day and, walking through the whole campaign and really crafting like what we would have done as far as a marketing campaign, but doing it for the band as opposed to doing it like how the label would want it. And it was really interesting. And I think the biggest lesson I learned right away was how much weight that email address of coming from Warner Brothers Records carries. You can get so much done when you're at a big company. And when you're not at a big company, you are on your own. And I learned that lesson really quick. I've carried it to this day that like, you don't have a big institution behind you that has that cachet that's going to like, get you in the door and get you, into meetings with people to get things done. Like you have to figure it out all yourself and be scrappy about it. And so that was kind of what we intended to do. And we ended up doing that for several years and working on a bunch of really interesting bands.
So, you worked with big artists, small artists. Did you learn any lessons from actually interacting with people and their teams that made you feel like I really think that all of this background and knowledge would serve me well if I were to run a company?
Music, as you know, obviously, can be filled with a lot of challenging personalities, interesting people with really different backgrounds, and it can be very high stress. I remember days where I would get woken up at 4 a.m. because like a Metallica album potentially leaked and I had to track down where it happened, somewhere in the deep corners of the internet, and then having to be out at like an artist's show until midnight that night, and then go and be ready for, a meeting first thing in the morning to talk about a marketing campaign. So I think being able to understand like that work is not always going to be just 9 to 5, that this particular line of work is going to extend beyond that. But then also just learning how to like deal with people with different personalities than yourself, especially in high stress situations where like everybody feels like things are on fire and the wheels are coming off and the band's upset and there's no talking to them, they're upset, there's nothing that you can say is going to fix it. I think a lot of that can really be applied to life in general, but definitely when starting a company is like, you know, everybody has a different personality. Everybody is motivated by something different. And it's really important to try to understand where people are coming from so that you can work with them and get the best out of them, whether that's your employees or partners or things like that. Obviously, that's a really challenging thing. It's always easier said than done. But definitely, I think that was the biggest takeaway for me when learning to deal with people was just like, some people can be very, very difficult and you still need to get the work done. So trying to figure out how to do that.
What is it like to turn something that is a passion and possibly a hobby to have that opportunity to turn that into a business?
Well, it's obviously an amazing privilege. It's also, a challenge that you need to make sure that you're giving it the seriousness that it deserves. At the same time, you don't want to lose your excitement for that. A lot of times, I found this particularly in music. After a while, I was like, I don't really want to go to shows anymore because I have to go to shows all the time for work, and I have to go tell the bands how great they were afterwards. And even though I'm exhausted, it's hard when, right, your interest in it as a hobby turns into work because then, like you said, you start analyzing it. I have friends who are writers and a lot of them, writers for TV and film and stuff, and they can't just enjoy it. They have to like be like, oh man, that was a mistake, that should have been in the second act. They're not in the movie, they're completely pulled out of it because they're looking at the structural mistakes. Or one of my best friends is a post-production audio supervisor, and in, we're watching TV or film or something, and he's like, oh my God, did you hear that level? And it's something that everyone gets into these things because they're passionate about them. And I think, with music before and now with spirits at Distiller, I think the challenge is to want to be an expert at what you do for work, but at the same time, you don't want to lose your interest that got you into it and your love for that subject matter. That work can sometimes muddy those waters a little bit. So I think that's the challenge, but it's also obviously like a huge privilege and opportunity to be given the trust and the belief in me and our team, from both our team members, people that kind of want to join the company and believe in the vision, but also, the folks who kind of helped us get started and help us go today. And I think like I've always been really humbled and honored by, working with Brent and the trust that he's placed in me in leading the team. And, I was the head of digital at his company, and I came to him with this idea, and he, was like, oh my gosh, that sounds great. We should do that. It's a very rare opportunity that people are afforded, that someone would say like, okay, yeah, you should lead that. Let's do this. Like that's a dream. So I also kind of pinch myself, and even when it gets difficult and when there's like hard decisions to be made and things like that, I still remember that this is an incredible opportunity that I've been afforded, that a lot of people will not have that opportunity in life. So I'm just a very lucky guy.
So, what is Distiller?
Distiller, it's a discovery engine for spirits. And the idea was, if you're standing in front of that wall, whether it's at a bar or a store, and whether you're there to buy a gift for somebody and you don't know the first thing about spirits, or you're a seasoned connoisseur that's just looking for information about some new release, there should be an easy to understand resource based upon, a community of people who, have provided ratings and things to really guide you to find what that is. And I remember a review of us early on when we first started said something like, it's like having one of those liquor experts with a waxed mustache, but in your pocket. We didn't want to be another kind of inside baseball, snooty kind of magazine or book or community just for connoisseurs. We wanted it to be for everybody. And if you didn't know anything, you wouldn't feel condescended to, or that it was daunting to just open it up and read about a product and say like, okay, I'm going to make my decision and I can trust it based on everything that I read here in Distiller. So, we started just with whiskey because there's just so many products out there. The goal was always that you could look at any product on a shelf and you would be able to find it in Distiller and make a decision based on it. But obviously with hundreds of thousands or even maybe millions of spirits out there in the world, it's a pretty daunting thing to get that many products into a database. So we started with whiskey. We've expanded now over the years to encompass every major spirit category, from tequilas and rums and brandies and vodkas and liqueurs and bitters and everything, all the way off to like, aquavits and Bijos. And we really are trying to kind of capture everything and have those all in the database. So, when we started, it was purely an informational resource. And now it's grown to the point where we are by far the biggest community of spirits enthusiasts on the planet. Just earlier this year crossed our 1 millionth tasting notes submitted by users in the platform. Every year we have millions of people coming through the platform to learn about spirits, to write their own tasting notes and leave ratings, to create lists, to comment back and forth with people. We've seen even informal tasting groups popping up in the community where you'll be like, oh my God, they're talking about swapping samples. So like one guy on the opposite side of the planet will buy a bottle and package up minis and send them across to people that he met in Distiller. We've tried to really never lose sight of that founding idea that like, this is for everybody. And it should be as easy as just opening up the app and reading a quick blurb about something, looking at a flavor profile to be able to make a decision about what to buy. So that was the founding idea, and that's what we've been trying to do ever since and continue to try to do to this day.
So, as a technically new CEO, like this is your first CEO gig, what are some of the things about starting a business that you didn't maybe participate in earlier businesses that you had to learn now as a CEO?
Well, certainly a lot of the legal stuff, you know, we've had just odd things over the years where you're just like, I never would have imagined a scenario like this that popped up. And, we have to kind of powwow with you and your team. And strategize through potential pitfalls and ways to kind of navigate things. So certainly the legal side of things. And then just like HR and kind of personnel management. I managed people before, but hiring people, having to, occasionally and unfortunately let people go, all of that was brand new to me. I'd never done any of that before. I'm a pretty introverted person. I'm a pretty emotional and sensitive person. So, dealing with things like that is really difficult. And I think, the intellectual challenges and the financial challenges and, strategy challenges, we don't talk a whole lot about, the personal and emotional challenges of like having your own personality tied to a company so wholly like this, like you're putting your heart and soul and every waking moment into something that I did not have any experience with and did not expect or foresee. A challenge, but has also been a huge opportunity for growth for me.
How have you evolved your leadership style and thought process on dealing with some of this?
Dealing with other companies and the people there, and tying your kind of plans and projections to things that they need to execute on, and then what to do if they don't. And we've had over the years companies huge and small, some of the biggest companies in our space that basically everyone's heard of at this point, trying to work on things with them, and then people get fired or departments get closed or the CEO's just a jerk and decides that he doesn't want to do what he said he was going to do or whatever it is. I think of it as like your company is a ship. The bigger it gets, the harder it is to turn. So like when you're a really small company without like a lot of things going on, you can turn that ship pretty quickly and head off in a different direction. But the longer you are a company, the bigger your company gets, the more things that you have going on, the harder it is to like kind of turn away from some of those things, especially if you've staked a lot on them or you've put a lot of time and money and energy into those things. Like some of those partnerships, if they don't work out, can be really, really challenging to try to pivot away from. So what I've learned, just to go back to your question, is it's really important when you're entering into, potential partnerships. It's good to get excited and it's good to think of all the great possibilities that could come from that. But it's also very, very important to think through what you're committing to that partnership, what time, what money, what resources, and how much of your plans are going to rely upon that. Because if it doesn't work out and you're left there kind of, high and dry, like what's that going to do? And I've learned that lesson kind of the hard way. Early on, we had some pretty important partnerships with some larger companies and just seemed like it was going to be a fantastic, opportunity for us that just didn't pan out because they didn't come through on their side of things. And yeah, they were in breach of the agreement, but what are we going to do? Go sue this company? Like it's not going to fly. So
That actually brings up, another part of like sort of the evolution of understanding, what's important in business, and that's kind of, we talk about this all the time. There's different strategies that you employ with the different people that you're working with. And I think that you're developing a business and you're creating a business, constantly being in disputes with people is so counterproductive to business. At the same time, you've got to really protect yourself and like know when the time is to like really focus on something that is important to fight for. And that's not always a clear line, right? Because it's not a black and white issue at any given time.
no, I think that's totally spot on. And often it's very rare that we're ever in business or life, I guess, faced with anything that it really is a black and white issue. It's always like, let's weigh the pros and cons here. What's it going to cost to fight this, even though we know we're right, versus like, is it just going to be more cost effective and better for our sanity and our time to handle this a different way or cut ties and move on to something else? So it comes down to strategy, right? And like, when you're going into a new partnership or a disagreement with a company or when bringing something to an end, it's strategy all the way through of like, what happens if this is the best case scenario and everything goes well? What happens if it's the worst case scenario and they don't do anything that they say that they're going to do? Or is there potential risk to us? What's the potential upside? I think it's really important to go into every new situation and every new interaction with third parties with that in mind. And I think that also is a lesson that I have learned through this whole process. When you start talking with, potential huge, huge partner, you're like, this could just break things wide open for us. You need to also look at, okay, well, what's it going to cost you? How long is it going to take? What's it going to, distract you from? Is it going to be worth it for you to pursue this? Even though it could be giant for you, it also very likely could not be. And what are the ramifications of that? And I think a lot of new business, owners and startup founders maybe don't think about that as much. They think about all the exciting stuff and not about the like practical stuff of like, well, what happens if that giant partnership or thing that you tried to build, you just spent six figures on it over 6 months and you wasted a bunch of time and now you didn't focus on this other thing that probably long term would have been more important for you.
How important is it to really think through a long-term plan and like what is an exit strategy, for instance, or how do you actually get there? Have you given that a lot more thought in recent years than you did when you started?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing that I probably annoy the team with at this point is like harping on you cannot lose sight of why you started this company and what got you to start it. What was the founding idea and the founding principle? Because to have been around as long as we have and to have attracted as many customers as we have and users of the platform, you've done something right. And even though you're constantly ideating and trying to make it better, there's a reason that these people came. There's a reason that they engage with your company and your brand. And you always have to keep that in mind and think about like, what is your mission statement? Why are you doing this? And have that inform all of your long-term kind of planning. So thinking about everything, that you want to build your long-term strategy, it has to be in line with that. Otherwise, you kind of become rudderless. And I think that's when you fall into that trap like that you mentioned where you just start pivoting wildly based upon some new exciting idea that came up in a meeting or that somebody else suggested. It's when you lose sight of why you started it. And that's not always wrong. I mean, plenty of companies that are huge now, they pivoted and they were about to fail and they pivoted and now they're, you know, giant billion-dollar unicorns. But I do think there's a trap that a lot of companies fall into, which is that it's exciting and fun to do new stuff all the time. There's a desire to constantly be trying to like solve a problem and figure it out and figure out what's going to get you to that next stage. And I think that all of that's important within the confines of like understanding what you are, what you're good at, what your core competencies are, and what motivates not just your customers, but your employees and your team. So I think that that has definitely been something that I, to your point, have thought about a lot more in the last few years. As we've aged as a company, as we've grown as a company, as the market has grown around us. When we first started, there was no such thing as on-demand alcohol delivery, as an example, or it was in its infancy. Now Drizzly's been acquired by Uber for, I think, $1 billion in stock and cash. Like, the market has changed. How people access information has changed. There were no apps doing what we were doing when we started, which is why we started it. Now there's tons of them. And I bet you if you went and talked to any of those people, they would say, oh, we started it because we saw what Distiller was doing, but we wanted to do it a different way or better, or however they, were thinking about it. So I think that's important too, is not to lose sight of, what you're good at, but also not to get stuck in just one way of doing things. You need to be able to adapt and change and grow. That's definitely kind of a larger thing that you have to think long term about, because you can't do that overnight, right? You have to be thinking about that in terms of like, where do we want to be in 2 years from now? Because we're going to have to start that today. I think definitely not thinking about what are we going to have done next week or a month from now. It's like, what do we want to have done, 1 to 5, 10 years from now, so we can start putting that into action now.
Obviously, COVID has affected so many different businesses. I'm pretty sure that COVID made drinking go up a little bit. Did you see any sort of significant change to your business?
So one study I saw, this was, I think, towards the tail end of last year, said that online alcohol sales increased by 400% in the first few months of COVID, which is wild. A lot of states are passing to-go cocktails and to-go alcohol delivery now, which was never a thing before. Generally, the traffic pattern that we follow and all kind of spirits related sites and apps follow is you have a little bit of a lull in the beginning of the year after the holidays, and then there's kind of spikes throughout the year around. And then as like fall comes, especially, in brown spirits, you look at like Google search traffic, it all starts to hockey stick around the holidays, and we're no exception. That's what happens with us. Since we've started, the week of Christmas has always been our highest week of traffic for the year. It's no surprise, but it's been a constant since we started. But then after that, the first kind of quarter, you tend to go down a little bit. There was a day last year in March was our highest traffic day of all time, which is wild for us because that doesn't ever happen, especially not in the beginning of the year. So if you look at our traffic patterns, there's just like this odd aberration in the beginning of last year where we just spiked out of nowhere when, in the past, that first quarter is generally pretty flat. We saw a huge increase in usage and interest. Like I said, we crossed our 1 millionth tasting note entered by users earlier this year. We were on track to hit that probably by the beginning of the second quarter. And obviously that just was accelerated by people being at home and trying to find things to occupy their time and get into new hobbies. And now we're seeing, and I think a lot of online businesses are seeing, people getting ready to go back out again, right? Put their phones away, put their computers away, and get back out into the world. And it's been interesting to see like how that affects traffic and where folks are coming from geographically and all that. So it's been definitely interesting. It's turned a lot of new people onto us.
What would you say is your most important lesson you've learned over the past few years of running Distiller?
Having patience is so important. I think approaching everything, every opportunity and every challenge with a level head and not getting too emotional, whether it's anger or excitement, you need to approach everything with a level of kind of critical thinking and trying things and let yourself fail. Early on for me, if we tried something and it didn't work, I took it as a personal failing. Like I screwed up. I didn't know, I made a mistake. I'm not smart enough, something like that. And I think that so much of success in life and in business is just picking yourself back up, dusting yourself off, and going back to work. Because it's never going to work all the time for anybody. It doesn't matter what you do. And you're going to have days where you're just not motivated and you're not feeling inspired and you still have a job to do. So I think that's an interesting lesson. When you're starting a startup, it's been romanticized so much in our culture that it's like, it's exciting and sexy. And it's like, there's all this, VC money and events and meetings and huge partnerships. And we're going to sell for, millions of dollars. And, the reality is that happens for a few people, but the majority of companies that succeed, it's because the people there work hard and they're trying really, really hard and they let themselves fail and they don't give up. They don't let those failures dissuade them. And I think that's the biggest lesson, that I've learned through this process, both in my own life and then with Distiller, is like, just let yourself take the leap. And if it succeeds, it succeeds. And that's amazing. If it fails, okay, you learned something from that and it's going to help drive you forward. So get back up, get back to work, and keep pushing forward, because that's the only way we ever succeed at anything. So that's definitely the biggest one for me.
I mean, I love working with you so much. You're just one of my favorite people in the world, for one. I've had the great privilege of being able to see your entire journey as it's been evolving. But one of the things that I admire so much about you is what you just said. Your level headedness and calmness is just a quality that you have just as a person, but I think is such an important part of being a great leader and a great CEO. And just combined with the fact that you saw a need in the market and combine that with this passion you have, makes me just, again, in awe of you. I think you're just such a badass for all of those things. So I would love to know what you think makes you a badass.
If anything that I do could be defined as being a badass, I think it's just perseverance in the face of challenge. It would be so much easier sometimes to just throw in the towel and be like, this is really hard. I don't want to do the hard things. But to leave a secure, great job and go out and build something that no one's ever built before. There's no track record for success. There's nothing you can look at and say, like, I'm going to do it just like that because I know it can work. But to go out and from thin air build something that you believe in is really scary. And I think in retrospect, kind of looking back on it, I think if I could just pat myself a little bit on the back. It's that like it takes a lot of courage to do something like that. It affects your personal finances and your career and your life and so much of, your relationships and everything. So definitely that. And I think I'm just very lucky to have the privilege to work with, people like you who have given us so much great advice over the years and helped us with so many challenging situations, and our amazing team members, the people who are on our team now, the people who've worked with us in the past that really believe in what we're doing and want to give it their all and want us to succeed and come to the company because they are excited about what we're doing and love the idea and want to participate in it. So, I tip my hat to them, and a lot of gratitude to those people too on our team that I have the privilege of working with every day, and obviously everyone on your team as well, who have been with us every single step of the way, which has been, just a huge privilege for us. So I want to say thanks for that as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day and running a company to be on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Lawyer Who Rocks. If you've enjoyed it and want to hear more from business badasses, make sure you hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. While you're at it, please give us a review. It really helps us grow the show. The Lawyer Who Rocks is produced by Sean Fox and HMLG. If you've got an idea for a podcast, you can find Sean online at sfpodcast.com. A big thank you to Aaron Jones for our theme music, to Jeff Gilbert at Hairball Media for our awesome artwork, and thanks to my entire team at HMLG. If you need a lawyer who rocks, find us at hmlglaw.com. On the next episode,
I sometimes can look at everything I do and see chaos or think I really need to focus in on one thing. But when I step away, I am like, yeah, it's badass that I pull all this stuff off.
This podcast has been brought to you by HMLG. If you need lawyers who rock, visit us on our website at hmlglaw.com, or be sure to follow us on social media at hmlglaw or at The Lawyer Who Rocks on all social media platforms. So I'm going to do an intro, and there we go.